Well, first of all, learning more about the size and the complexity of this threat, which is more than just a threat to our own individual security, it's becoming a threat to countries. The origin of organized crime, the way we understand it, in Italian, we would call it mafia, international mafias. It really goes back to the 70s and the 80s at the national level. But it became a global problem after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. The Cold War had divided the world into blocks. As the blocks disappeared, and globalization took over and became a form of creating revenue, creating prosperity and trade, while it was also taking advantage of organized crime, which have become truly globalized. And that problem per se, the nature of organized crime, the size of it, is becoming a major concern at the United Nations and in member states. We have a number of countries and regions actually in the world threatened by them because of the smuggling of narcotics, the trafficking of human beings, the trafficking of arms. I have in mind West Africa, which today is attacked literally by traffickers of cocaine, for example, from Colombia and the Andes, transatlantic traffic. And then, of course, the Horn of Africa, trafficking of narcotics from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, opium and arms, and illicitly exploiting natural resources, people, women, migrants. Central America, of course, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia. So we do have on many theaters the presence of organized crime, which is not only buying economic assets, real estate, and recycling money, but it's buying power, it's buying elections, it's buying admirals, presidents, generals, police forces, and therefore rooting itself, placing themselves within this society in a way that will become a security threat for humanity. But that is, the point you're raising is exactly what I had in mind. Organized crime is penetrating this area because they are vulnerable, because there is no control of the borders, no air space control, no sea control, nothing. So they have, globalization has allowed them logistically to penetrate this more vulnerable societies. I just had in mind an example of a major supply of chemical precursors which are used to refine drugs into cocaine or heroin and so forth, coming from China, seized, we saw it, seized in Congo, was on his way to Mexico, and eventually got lost once the police in Congo was not competent enough. But the whole logic of illicitly traded commodity which move from one continent far away as Asia is, from Congo, going through Congo because of the vulnerability of that country, in order to reach another market, namely Mexico, so as to penetrate eventually the United States as a finished product. That gives you an idea, this simple example, and this happened a few months ago, of the various elements there, the ability of the networks to penetrate, the easiness of the logistics, and of course the vulnerability of countries which are not able to protect themselves. There are 2 or 3 countries in the world which are known for major cultivation of drugs. Colombia and the Andean, some of the Andean countries for cocaine, coca leaves. Afghanistan, the foremost country cultivating opium. And of course, some of the Southeast Asia countries, in particular Myanmar. But today, Afghanistan is characterized by the largest cultivation of illicit drugs. In 2009, they had 130,000 hectares of cultivation, which is the largest since China centuries ago. The cultivation takes place not throughout Afghanistan. 20 of the 34 provinces of Afghanistan are opium-free. Cultivation is especially in the areas which are under insurgency and under control by basically the Taliban and other anti-government groups. Why this? Is because the insurgents need money. They need tens, even I would say, hundreds of millions of dollars to buy pickups and weapons and pay the infantry, communication gears and so forth. And all of this, of course, can only be or can best be, these resources can best be generated by taxing or promoting the cultivation and taxing the cultivation, taxing the labs and the processing, the transformation of raw opium into heroin or morphine and exporting this. So this is creating, obviously, a very dangerous link between insurgency, organized anti-government groups, and organized crime. to a point that after so many years of cultivation, in Afghanistan, it started at the time of the Russian invasion in 1980. After so many years of cultivation and so many years of Taliban presence in the 90s and then, of course, in the recent years, it is almost impossible to separate organized crime and insurgency in so many areas. Insurgents are creating their own cartels to traffic whatever they need to sell in order to generate revenue. That is per se a drama which is being lived through in Afghanistan, but it's also a drama in the neighboring countries. In Pakistan, of course, a lot. About a third of the Afghan opium is exported through Pakistan to be exported further on into Europe, into the Gulf, into the east of Africa. A lot of it goes, another 40% goes through Iran, and again, partly creating havoc in Iran and partly exported through Iraq, northern Iraq, Turkey, into Balkan routes, and eventually in Europe. Even the remaining, about 20% or so, is exported via Central Asia, creating havoc in Russia, Central Asia itself, and then Russia and the former Soviet Union. Now, in the process, the narcotics transiting via areas which are fundamentally unstable, the frontier regions of Pakistan, some of the Central Asian countries, even West China, the Xinjiang province of East China, is funding insurgency and is funding terrorist cells, is funding groups, which eventually can be even more problematic than they are at the moment in Afghanistan and at the border of Afghanistan. So what can be done? Well, first and foremost, we have to win the mind, the hearts, and the wallet of the Afghans. Too many people stop at the hearts and the mind, but we need to bring development in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. Many of the foot soldiers, certainly not the leaders, certainly not the terrorists who decide on strikes and decide on the attacks, but certainly the foot soldiers are poor Afghans and poor Pakistani who would be better off employed into a regular job. Point number two, some of these countries, certainly Afghanistan, are characterized by very significant amount of poor governance, to call it nicely. I would call it perhaps even corruption. The central government, in provincial administration, in various government activities, the police force, the army, and so on and so forth. All of this has to come to an end. And unless following the elections in Afghanistan, a totally different way of managing the country is pursued, I'm afraid the drug economy, the industry of narcotics will continue to prevail. And of course, we have the other neighboring countries, particularly the Central Asian countries. These are countries potentially, at least some of them, like Kazakhstan, very rich because of oil and because of ability to export. Democracy, respect of human rights, and above all, the diffusion of wealth, which is being generated throughout the population and throughout the region, in itself could become a major force to contrast otherwise individuals who just find in the turbulence of the region north of Afghanistan a good way of drafting new volunteers, drafting individuals who will eventually become even more problematic than they are now. First of all, and perhaps looking inward at the United Nations, we were very pleased that member states at the United Nations, actually in Vienna, where we are located, negotiated and agreed the first instruments against human trafficking. This happened in December. The negotiations ended in December 2000. The protocol, as it is called, the protocol against human trafficking, entered into force in 2003. I believe that per se that moment where member states agreed collectively to a universal instrument is the recognition there was a problem and the beginning of some action and some measures, some initiative to deal with it. Now, after this, in a sense, a promising statement, I may also say that as of today, namely 7, 8 years after the entry into force of the protocol, about 1/3 of the United Nations member states have not ratified. And so they are not party of this process of creating common policies and joint measures against human trafficking. I would even say that there is one G8 member that has not yet ratified this protocol. Second element, which is disturbing, while the protocol calls for important measures to prevent the problem and help the victims and criminalize the crime of human trafficking, as of today, namely 7-8 years after the entry into force of the protocol, 1/3, I take it back, today, 1/2 of the United Nations member states have not registered any single conviction. Not a single conviction in half of the United Nations member states. That is a serious problem. It shows that there's no following international agreement, there is no aggressive way of introducing whatever has been decided into domestic practice, in domestic legislation, domestic measures. I would like to mention also, as a second piece of evidence, that 7-8 years since the entry into force of the protocol, about half of the member states of the United Nations have not registered a single conviction. Not one single person was convicted for trafficking human beings. That is, since we consider that crime is universal, it does take place everywhere, in rich countries, in poor countries, black and white, and whatever other shades of color one could think. The fact that half of the United Nations membership has not been able to, or not competent enough, or has been negligent about bringing culprits to court, I believe that is evidence that the international agreements are not put into place the way they should. Now, the third piece of evidence, which it's interesting, is the fact that while we do not know the total amount of, let me say, slaves which are now under the condition of detention in one way or another, and forced labor and exploitation, last year when we had numbers, which is 2008, only 22,000 victims were saved. 22,000 out of what could be perhaps 1 million or more slaves is 2% of the slaves being rescued. That is, again, another piece of evidence that while international agreements are in place, not all member states are equally active. And so my advocacy, my request through very noble networks like PBS is to do even more, but throughout the world, in order to make public opinion aware of the tragedy of the slaves and the inept attitude in so many quarters, in so many countries.
And just finally, if national governments don't have the capacity to deal with issues like human trafficking, I guess that only leaves the international community, the multilateral organizations like the United Nations, to try to do this. What tools do you have within the UN and also in the other multilateral or transnational organizations to do something about this?
Well, we work, obviously, by definition, first and foremost, with member states. And obviously, the pressure which we put on member states to ratify, to be proactive, is the first entry point in this type of exercise. Second entry point is, of course, assistance to some countries which are truly not able because of inefficiency of the system, poverty of the judicial system, lack of preparation and skills. And so we do provide resources, we use resources, we are given resources by the rich countries in order to assist the poor countries. Point number 3, leaving aside member states, NGOs, non-governmental institutions, civil society can play a huge role. We are partnering with so many thousands of NGOs in so many areas. One area where we do a lot of work is drug prevention and, above all, treatment of drug addicts, but also fighting those the crime of distribution and profiteering out of drug trafficking. So in the case of human trafficking, there is a lot that individuals, single or grouped into civil society institutions, can do. Civil society institutions can provide shelters, and we are helping them to do so in so many countries around the world, can develop victims protection, can develop way of assisting the victims to regain the control of their life through some sort of small credits and small sums of money to give them the chance to start a new life, to obtain residence there and immigration rights there where they have been rescued. Individuals themselves can do a lot. To begin with, the crime would not exist if there were no demand. A lot of the activities, services, and the work which are done by slaves can be prevented by just not asking for these services, first and foremost, at least in rich countries, sex services. So my appeal, especially to those who are attracted by exotic sex, is to keep the zipper up, and that would certainly reduce that crime in itself. But then there are other forms of personal involvement. For example, it does happen that you have slaves, especially sex slaves, in our own neighborhood, in our own block, city block, or whatever. And it's just a question of being more aware that it happens everywhere, and we have green numbers or toll-free numbers which can be used to alert the authority, to alert NGOs to intervene, to alert social services so as to provide assistance. So there is a lot that individuals can do, leaving aside, of course, providing funds on a personal basis, a tax-deductible fund to institutions like ours, which can then recycle them to the benefit of the victims.